Tonight's moderator is going to be Roger Kimball, just to my left. In addition to, and I'm sure this probably doesn't need to be said, but in addition to serving as the co-editor and publisher of the New Criterion, Roger is president and publisher of Encounter Books, and he's an art critic for the London Spectator and the National Review. He's the author, most recently, of The Rape of the Masters, How Political Correctness Sabotages Art. He's also the author of Art's Prospect, The Challenge of Tradition in an Age of Celebrity, Lives of the Mind, The Use and Abuse of Intelligence from Hegel to Wodehouse, Experiments Against Reality, The Fate of Culture in the Postmodern Era, The Long March, How the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s Changed America, and Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Our Higher Education. And he has been a contributor to or co-editor of several other volumes, and he's written for many, many publications, both here in the US and in Britain, including, of course, the New Criterion, the TLS, Modern Painters Literary Review, the Wall Street Journal, the Public Interest Commentary, the Spectator, New York Review of Books, I'm sorry, the New York Times Book Review, the Sunday Telegraph, sorry. Wow, Age of Freud's not past us yet. The Weekly Standard, First Things, American Outlook, the National Review, and the National Interest, and several others that I'm going to pass over in embarrassment now. One more bit of housekeeping, and then I'll get out of your way. Later in the evening, the panel is going to be taking audience questions. If you choose to make a statement, well, if you choose to ask a question, please keep in mind that they're for question asking, not statement making, and the microphones that you should use are at either end of the auditorium. Thank you very much. Roger Kimball.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Michael. Yes, I've often wondered why Bob Silvers omitted to ask me to write for the New York Review of Books, but there you are. And thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like, on behalf of the New Criterion and its staff, I'd also like to thank the Center for the Humanities here at the City University of New York, and especially Professor Andre Osman, who could not be with us tonight, but who was instrumental in helping to arrange this. We're delighted to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the New Criterion and the publication of Counterpoints in an institution such as this, dedicated to the life of the mind. It will shock you, I know, but on many college campuses, the New Criterion is not on the list of most favored journals. Indeed, at many cultural institutions, and not only universities, we have sometimes felt that we are actively disliked. It's difficult to believe, I know, but it's true. I think, for example, of the time I was lecturing at a college in Providence, Rhode Island. My wife taught there at the time, and I had been invited to give a talk about multiculturalism. One of her colleagues digested what I had to say and then rushed into print in the college newspaper to accuse me of being a Nazi. He did not, I feel pretty sure, mean that kindly. Well, it has been ever thus for the New Criterion. Of course, a lot has changed since September 1982, when Hilton Kramer brought out the first issue of the magazine. Back then, there was still something called the Soviet Union, a minatory, seemingly intractable behemoth which, for most observers, seemed destined to lumber on indefinitely. The top marginal tax rate back then had just been cut from 70% to 50%. But in August of that year, 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dipped to 776, which is 13,000 and something today. And many were the bulletins back then alerting us to the impending death of equities. By 1982, we'd suffered through the disgusting spectacle of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the brazen economic blackmail of OPEC, and how many of our current political woes were engendered by our inadequate response to those assaults, I wonder. But Al-Qaeda was not yet even a twinkling in the mullah's eyes. No one, near enough, in 1982 had heard of email, cell phones, or the internet, and the words multiculturalism and political correctness had yet to be enlisted to register the burgeoning pathologies that they named. The university, then as now, was essentially, with a few exceptions, a one-party state, its reflexive, hermetic leftism still untroubled by such broadsides as Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. It came out in 1987. Elsewhere in the world of art, culture, and intellectual life, a similarly sclerotic complacency reigned. The term diversity had yet to emerge as the favored shibboleth of those bent on enforcing conformity, but the conformity itself was already deeply entrenched. Standards, aesthetic as well as intellectual, were low, but then so were expectations. Words like transgressive and challenging had just begun their bizarre mutation into terms of critical commendation, while traditional epithets such as beautiful, technically accomplished, even true, were drifting into desuetude. What the historian Elie Kaduri called the Chatham House version, that toxic amalgam of smugness, moral relativism, and cherished feelings of guilt about the achievement of Western civilization, everywhere nurtured the catechism of established opinion. This, of course, was a world allergic to dissent, and it was no surprise that when the new Criterion first appeared, the reaction was astonishment, followed quickly by rage. Astonishment that anyone would even think of starting an unabashedly conservative journal devoted to serious culture and the arts, and rage that said party would have the temerity to translate that thought into action. We were at first taken aback and then mildly amused by the fury of the left liberal, especially the academic left liberal response to the debut of the new Criterion. One common, if unarticulated, assumption was that by presuming to intervene in the cultural debate from a conservative perspective, we had somehow violated an unspoken pact. Culture, art, intellectual life, wasn't all of that the prerogative of the left? Who were we, upstarts, presuming to contribute to the war of ideas and cultural controversy? We early on lost count of the accusations that we were a nefarious tool of the Reagan administration, as if we had a kind of hotline on the desk of our publisher that we could call it the Oval Office at any moment. After our first issue appeared in September 1982, the New Republic ran an hysterical piece that, inter alia, insinuated some dark connection between the new Criterion and the Olin Corporation, a munitions manufacturer. It certainly made for some entertaining press, and overall reinforced our fondness for William Dean Howell's observation that the problem for a critic is not making enemies, but keeping them. We've done pretty well in that score, I think. The new Criterion, in fact, has always owed a lot to its enemies. They early on attributed to us an influence and a connection to the corridors of power far greater than we in fact possessed. And by so doing, they helped assure our success, amplifying our authority by the simple expedient of decrying it. Now, the business of a critic, said Walter Bagehot, the 19th century English man of letters, is to criticize, fairly simple. To criticize, what does that mean? Well, T.S. Eliot put it very well, I think, when he said that to criticize means to sift, to compare, to discriminate, to judge. The fundamental task of criticism is to distinguish good from bad, and its severest test is to select the good and lasting from the noisy throng of new works clamoring for attention today. Most cultural artifacts today, as always, are mediocre or worse. Recent cultural life is subject to some special deformations, above all, I think, an ongoing ambition to politicize culture and a concomitant effort to blur the distinction between high and low, good and bad, accomplished and merely spurious. For us at the New Criterion, the imperative of judgment, of criticism, has always revolved around primarily two tasks. The first task is negative. It's the negative task of forthright critical discrimination. To a large extent, that meant the job of intellectual and cultural trash collector, garbage collector. In the note to our inaugural issue, we spoke of applying a new criterion to the discussion of cultural life, a criterion of truth. The truth was, and still is, that much of what presents itself as art and culture today can scarcely be distinguished from political sermonizing on the one hand, or the pathetic recapitulation of Dadaist pathologies on the other. Mastery of the artifice of art is mostly a forgotten, often an actively disparaged goal. At such a time as today, simply telling the truth is bound to be regarded as an unwelcome provocation, or so at least we have found. In the university and in other institutions entrusted with preserving and transmitting the cultural capital of our civilization, kindred deformations are at work. Pseudo-scholarship propagated by a barbarous, reader-proof prose and underwritten by adolescent political animus is the order of the day. The new Criterion sallied forth onto this cluttered battlefield, determined not simply to call attention to the emperor's new clothes, but to do so with wit, clarity, and literary panache. We acknowledge that these have been hard times for the arts of satire and parody, because with increasing velocity, today's reality has a way of outstripping yesterday's satirical exaggeration. Nevertheless, the new Criterion has always been distinguished by its effective deployment of satire, denunciation, ridicule, all of the astringent resources in the armory of polemic. And that is one of the things that enabled the magazine to live up to Horace's injunction to delight as well as instruct. But the new Criterion is not only about polemics, and maybe not even mostly about polemics. As a glance at the contents of our current issue, which you can see, you can get copies on the table outside, or the table of contents of Counterpoints, also available outside. As a glance at either of these shows, an equally important part of criticism revolves around the task of battling what we might call cultural amnesia. From our first issue, nearly a quarter century ago, we labored in the vast storehouse of cultural achievement to introduce or reintroduce readers to some of the salient figures whose works helped to weave the great unfolding tapestry of our civilization. Writers and artists, philosophers and musicians, scientists, historians, controversialists, explorers, politicians. The new Criterion has specialized in resuscitating important figures whose voices have been drowned out by the demotic inanities of pop culture or embalmed by the dead hand of the Academy. The new Criterion is not, we hope, a somber publication, but it is a serious one. We look to the past for enlightenment and to art for that humanizing education and ordering of the emotions that distinguish the man of culture from the barbarian. I'd like to conclude with just a word or two about politics. The new Criterion is often described as conservative and praised or disparaged according to the political coloration of the speaker. In fact, we are a liberal publication, understanding the term liberal in the sense that Russell Kirk used it when he observed that he was conservative because he was a liberal. That sounds paradoxical, but it really isn't. Conservative, that means wanting to conserve what is worth preserving from the ravages of time and ideology, evil and stupidity. In some plump eras, as Evil and Waugh observed in one of his essays, the task of conserving culture is so easy that we can almost forget how necessary it is. At other times, the enemies of culture transform the task of preserving culture into a battle for survival. And that, I think, is where we are today. And that is one reason that the new Criterion's effort to tell the truth about culture is as important today as it was in 1982. Counterpoints, which can be yours at an attractive discount tonight, provides a wide-ranging record of our contributions to that imperative task. I am honored that Judge Robert Bork, Anthony Daniels, Eric Ormsby, and Mark Steyn, all contributors to the new Criterion and to Counterpoints, have joined me here tonight. Each will give a brief presentation, taking off from their essay in Counterpoints, and then we will be delighted to entertain questions, comments, exhortations, and animadversions, provided, of course, that you use the microphones at either end of the hall. Thank you very much.
Are these things live?
I think so. I think so.
Is this thing live? Swell. I trust you will forgive me for sitting down when I deliver this paper, but the last time I followed Roger on a panel, I fell off the dais and wound up in the hospital. And I'm not taking any chances with you tonight, Roger. The fact is that no other magazine in America could produce a volume like Counterpoints. The new Criterion could have, I'm sure, produced a half dozen volumes out of their 25 years or more volumes of equal sophistication and profundity. But we have one volume for which must be grateful, The range and the depth of the magazine is probably such that no other magazine in America can match that. And the talent of the contributors is unmatched. You can see that from the speakers who follow me, but also from the authors in the volume, including preeminently Hilton Kramer and Roger Kimball, and Roger Scruton, Kenneth Minogue, Gertrude Himmelfarb, Heather MacDonald, and others too numerous to mention. I think you're probably familiar with a lot of those names. If you're not, you must subscribe to the new Criterion. I won't denigrate these folks by calling them intellectuals, since that name has been brought into disrepute by the denizens of the faculty lounges in our major universities. They are simply highly intelligent men and women who wear their learning and their profundity lightly, and they write prose that makes very important ideas accessible. They write very clearly. They do not write for the new Criterion for financial compensation. Given the, to put it mildly and kindly, modesty of its payments, they write for the magazine because of the elite audience it reaches. And it is not a mass circulation magazine. It should be, but it's not yet. But at the outset, 25 years ago, it was much smaller. The subscription list was very small. And I was at some kind of a reception when Samuel Lipman, the first publisher of the magazine, heard my name and came over and said, "You're one of our subscribers." And I thought, gee, I'm being recognized for change. And I began to preen and get my tie in place. And I said, "You must have a great memory." He said, "No, it's just that we have so few subscribers." But it's grown since then a great deal, but it could, I think the world would be a better place if it grew even more. Now, I never thought I would write for the magazine because it just seemed, if you look at the contents, I just didn't think I would be able to. But I met Roger, and for some reason he asked me to contribute a piece, and I did. And my article in the book has a quite simple message. It's about the Supreme Court and what it's done to the culture, what it is doing to the culture. For 50 years, the court has attacked conventional morality. It's been busy privatizing morality, and is following the agenda of the intelligentsia. If you follow what's being said in the law schools, which are heavily liberal, you will find the same thing is happening in the Supreme Court, usually 5-4. We're doing better now. It used to be 7-2. Now it's 5-4, but we're still losing. The fact is that the court it's conventional to call it an activist court, an activist majority. And some people don't think that the word activist has any meaning, that it merely means that you disagree with the result. Not at all. The word activist has a meaning, and it's an important one. It applies to a judge who announces principles and reaches conclusions that cannot plausibly be related to the actual Constitution. And we see a lot of that. Much of the Constitution we live under today has little to do with the Constitution adopted some years ago. The fact is that if what the court majority shows is absolute power, because when the court speaks, all other institutions give way. So it has absolute power. It has disdain for the historic Constitution, and it displays philosophical incompetence. And those are lethal combinations. Now, when I say that it follows the agenda of the liberal intelligentsia, I think just one example can make that clear. That is the distinction between pornography, which the court protects against almost any attempt to limit it, and religious speech, which the court makes every effort to expunge from our public life. And why pornography is superior to religion, I don't know, but the court seems to think so. They speak of religion, in their opinions, as a toxic force. And an illustration of that is this. There was the court held that high school students could not pray before a game, football game, that nobody be hurt, because that was an establishment of religion forbidden by the First Amendment. On the other hand, the court also held that nude dancing was entitled to considerable constitutional protection because it was expressive, and therefore under the speech clause of the First Amendment. Now, one wasn't inquired too closely about what is being expressed by these nude dancers, but that's the way it is. This led Ted Olson, who was the former Solicitor General, he argued the case for George Bush against Al Gore in the Supreme Court. But he took a look at these two cases and said, since nude dancing is preferred to prayer as a form of communications, perhaps the students should dance naked before ball games. And I said, well, that's all right, but they must not get naked by doing the dance of the seven veils, because that has biblical connotations, and the ACLU would be all over the place. But anyway, now the prospects for the court, I think, are fairly gloomy. I'm sorry to say this. We've come close. You may gather from my attitude that I think Scalia and Thomas and Roberts and Alito are fine choices. But that's 4 votes. That's not enough. I don't know when we're going to get the 5th vote. If one of the current justices left the court now, George Bush does not have enough political power to get a really good justice in before he leaves office. And if the Democrats win in 2008, the presidency and the Senate, or either one, the court we're in for a long period of an activist, liberal, left liberal court. I think that's gloomy enough. Now, I have a problem now about writing articles for the new Criterion. I've already given up teaching constitutional law for the same reason. Because you go from case to case, and after a while you find yourself saying, they've done it again. Rather than, and you can't really keep people's interest by saying they've done it again. And it leads me to a kind of a gloomy outlook. And my wife got a little tired of people calling me a pessimist and gloomy, and she asked me to write my next book as a cheerful book. So I said I would, and it was going to be called Little Mary Sunshine. Unfortunately, Kate O'Byrne of National Review was there. She said, don't believe him. It's going to be called Little Mary Sunshine Gets Skin Cancer. Well, that is where we are, so far as my contribution to the magazine is concerned.
Ladies and gentlemen, Roger, I'm very honored to be here tonight on an auspicious occasion like this. 25 years for a publication that has never lowered its standards is an astonishing performance and a great tribute not only to those who have edited it and written in it, but to those who've supported it throughout this period, and that, of course, is you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I'm afraid I've already reached the stage in life when what happened 6, 7, 8, 9, or even 10 years ago seems to me like last month. So I can't tell you exactly when Roger first wrote to me enclosing copies of the new Criterion and asked me to contribute, which I must say is one of the most fortunate invitations of my life. Not that I've had that many, I have to confess. Now, I admit that I have a slightly odd approach to literary and cultural criticism. Because I still do a certain amount of medico-legal work, I read almost everything now as if it were the prosecution papers in a case of murder. And in a way, this is surprisingly helpful, at least to me, because it makes one look for consistency, sincerity, truth-telling, and so forth. And on the whole, there's more of it in the case papers for murder than there is in literature. There's nothing much worse than a witness who constantly gilds the lily, and I'm afraid I think there's a lot of that kind of thing going on in modern cultural life. Perhaps it's always gone on, but it just seems now worse now that I'm an adult and in a position to comment on it. Well, because I'm a doctor as well as a writer, and because I've travelled extensively and seen a bit of the world, I've never thought that of intellectual life as concerning only the intelligentsia. And I confess that as a result of some of my experiences, that I've been somewhat preoccupied with the problem of evil, and one of my contributions to the book is on that problem, evil. And there are really three reasons why I've been preoccupied with it. The first is that my mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany who arrived in England a few months before the outbreak of the war. And 18 months ago, just after her death, I found some letters written to her by her father, that's my grandfather, who was a doctor, and whom she never saw again once she came to England at the age of 18. But he and my grandmother managed to escape to Shanghai in China in about a month before war broke out. Well, in 1942, he wrote a letter to my mother from Shanghai, and he didn't write in English until he was in his 50s. But what he said was this: "It is a beautiful spring morning and the sun is shining brightly, but there is no sun bright enough to penetrate the dark clouds that are covering the whole earth." Well, I think in our great pride and security, we should never forget that impenetrably dark clouds can cover not only the whole earth, but any part of the earth, including our own. And we should understand the fragility of civilization, and that there is no final victory over barbarism. Well, as I mentioned also, I travelled extensively, including to countries in which the whole population of villages have been obliterated and massacres recently committed, and so on and so forth. And I must admit that I actually liked going to these countries because they settled for me, or they obviated the need to think too deeply about the meaning of life. Well, but it made me think about the question of evil. And finally, when I returned to England, I discovered a degree of everyday malignity in my patients that I had not previously suspected, and perhaps was something that was new. The levels of violence and sheer malice in the population as a mass phenomenon came to me as a surprise. And in pondering the reasons for the prevalence of this malice and of self-destructiveness of a positively Baroque or even Rococo, not to say Byzantine extravagance, I came to think that culture, or perhaps I should say the lack of culture, played an enormously important part. And that is where the new Criterion came to my rescue. It was not only a refuge, a bit like a quiet club into which one might retreat from the city outside, but it seemed to me that it was one of the few publications that took seriously the idea that culture, in the sense of arts, history, philosophy, and so forth, was important far beyond the academy, and that, to take one example, literary criticism was not a matter of one professor trying to outdo another in incomprehensibility and irrelevance to anything except tenure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think Hilton, Kramer, and Roger Kimball may be justly proud of their achievement for having so long and so stoutly defended what I will call civilization without the usual quotation marks. And I should like to thank you all and commend you all also for your support for their sterling work. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm almost as astonished to be here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the New Criterion as I am pleased and honored. I first encountered the New Criterion under inauspicious circumstances in a dingy bookstore in Miami some 20 years ago. And amid the other publications, it struck me by the combination of elegance and playfulness of its design. And I was immediately captivated by the combination, which Roger has alluded to, in its contents of elegant prose, considerable learning, lightly worn, and a rather wicked sense of humor, which was displayed on page after page. I became addicted. I haunted the bookstore every month waiting for the new issue. The bookstore was destroyed by Hurricane Andrew, but the New Criterion continues on, I'm happy to say. I was equally delighted some years later to be invited by David Yezzi to write a review for the New Criterion. And after which I was coming to New York and I was invited to come to the offices, which were then at 850 7th Avenue, to enjoy Sammy's. I wasn't sure what a Sammy was, but it sounded quite intriguing. It turned out to be sandwiches from the Carnegie Deli, I believe, which certainly won me over completely. It has been not only an honor, but a distinct pleasure to write for the New Criterion. I have never before dealt with such wonderful ladies and gentlemen as are on the staff, as well as the fellow writers of the magazine, and it's a constant sense of pleasure to be in their company. In my own contribution to Counterpoints, I tried to draw on some of the training which I received as an Islamist, not a popular profession nowadays. Actually, it was a profession I chose because at the time it was so completely obscure and irrelevant that I thought I could safely pursue my studies without any undue interruption. I was quickly disabused. But in the article, I was interested in making 2 points, or perhaps 3, one of them more tacitly than others. The first was that it seemed to me that it's rarely considered in discussing translations of Scripture that this is a totally different kind of enterprise than the translation of a work of literature, however great it may be. And I wanted to draw attention to that. Whether or not you believe the Scripture is true, nevertheless, it happens to be a text which people have suffered and died and lived by over centuries. And it seemed to me, and I may be wrong, but I feel pretty strongly about this, that a translation of such a text involves a lot more intuition, insight, and love, if I may say so, than the ordinary translation of a work of literature. In my own training, I happen to have been trained by people who came out of the 19th century philological tradition, usually in Germany, in which the similarities between the Judaic and the Islamic tradition was emphasized, not the differences. They were seen as, in a sense, almost as a cognate culture. And so that was another reason why I chose to consider Robert Alter's translation of the 5 books of Moses in tandem with a new translation of the Quran, because I felt that they belonged in a certain sense to a common culture, a fact which has been obscured for obvious reasons in recent years. I was also very intrigued by the paradox that Robert Alter approached the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, purely as a literary endeavor. This ran counter to my own feelings about the kind of translation that was required of a sacred text, and yet it seemed to me that he succeeded splendidly. And that led me to another consideration, which has a bearing on the translation of the Quran, that a translation of such a text is not merely a matter of finding the most accurate philological meaning of a given ancient word, but also of trying to convey the tone, the feeling, the very vibrancy of the word itself. In other words, its form as well as its actual semantic meaning. This is preeminently true in translations of the Quran, because it's an article of faith for Muslims, that it's not merely what the Quran says, but how it says it that conveys the message. This was a point I wanted to bring out particularly, and also the fact that the scriptures in both cases depend for a great deal for their power on the beauty which they create in their verbal patterns. Alter brings this out very, very well in his translation, and Mr. Abdul Salim, in his translation of the Quran, tries mightily to do this, but of course fails. It can't be done. And yet I thought it was very important to emphasize this. Alter speaks very harshly of what he calls the heresy of explanation. We've all seen this, in which you avoid the biblical parallelisms, the repetitions, and try always to find a fresh synonym or phrase to make it look new all the time, and yet that's quite contrary to the intent of the text. And the same is true of the Quran. So I was trying in a way, I suppose, to deal with both of these powerful and explosive texts in a non-political way, although I'm not so naive as to believe that's entirely possible, and yet I hope that perhaps in the hospitality of the pages of the new Criterion, that might be possible for once. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be part of the 25th birthday celebrations for one of my favorite publications, and to be here with Roger and Judge Bork and Dr. Daniels and Professor Ormsby. I think of myself as a bit of a newcomer and a Johnny-come-lately to the new Criterion, but in fact I've been writing for it for half its 25 years, which comes as a bit of a shock to me. It was in 1994 that I was invited to make my first contribution. I didn't know Roger, but I'd met Hilton Kramer just once. I used to host a BBC show at their Rockefeller Center studios, and Hilton was a guest one week, along with Graydon Carter, who's the editor of Vanity Fair. And if you're a foreigner, it's sometimes hard, keeping up with which big shot New York editor is which. Hilton Kramer, Graydon Carter, Graydon Kramer, Hilton Carter, it all. But I knew one of them had a lavish corporate dress allowance provided by his publishers. And I was fairly certain, no disrespect, that wasn't Hilton. It's just that when Graydon Carter enters the room, he seems to be sort of metaphorically preceded by one of those on-screen credits that says, Mr. Carter's wardrobe furnished by Hugo Boss, or Jeeves and Hawkes, or Sacco and Vanzetti, or whoever it is. Graydon Carter's magazine also has, of course, an annual Hollywood issue featuring nude starlets with artfully positioned bits of the leaf from the rubber tree plant snaking across their naughty bits. Whereas Hilton Kramer's general line on motion pictures is summed up by a story that he once told me a couple of years ago. Hilton and his wife had gone to their local movie theater in Maine to see some current hit. And as they left, she said to him, "Darling, from now on, let's not see any film we haven't already seen." And that's good advice. And of course, Graydon Carter's magazine is heavily perfumed by its lavish perfume advertisers. In fact, if you find it in the dentist's waiting room, it's often so headily intoxicating you want to ask it if you can buy it a drink. Whereas the new Criterion is perfumed only by its writing, though some of our foes might dispute what precisely the odor is. Anyway, Hilton and Roger asked me to write a piece for them, and I did, but I still wasn't sure I was quite right for such a prestigious publication. I noticed from the table of contributors that everyone else seemed to have some cockamamie title like professor or doctor or even judge. I was invited to dinner at Buckingham Palace a while back, and I realized sort of over the hors d'oeuvre that I was among a table of royal dukes and princesses and viscounts and earls and baronets and a couple of humdrum knights. I was the only Mr. in the room. And I see I'm again the token Mr. on tonight's panel. I believe there's a website in Turkmenistan where I could download a judgeship diploma for $50, but I didn't want Judge Bork to feel I was muscling in on his turf. I think he paid a lot more for his. I spoke at a New Criterion event a few months ago, and it was just after I'd heard a speech on immigration, in which a government official had mentioned that on the southern border, the Border Patrol divides the people it catches into two categories, Mexican and OTM, which stands for other than Mexican. And I said at this New Criterion event that, speaking as a member of the OTM community myself, the New Criterion must be the biggest employer of OTMs in America. Every other employer is employing Mexicans, but Roger is gamely employing the OTMs. There's at least a couple of us here tonight, and in this book you'll find many more. Kenneth Minogue and John Gross and David Frum, Mordecai Richler, Keith Windschaftel. You know, whenever the president uses that line about how America needs foreigners to come here to do the jobs Americans won't do, you know, I always assumed he meant just a little light seasonal fruit picking. It's a bit of a shock to discover that apparently one of the jobs Americans won't do is right for the New Criterion. Judge Bork is a rare exception, but I gather Roger is thinking of outsourcing his contributions to a call centre in Bombay. So even at any rate, the New Criterion is an invaluable resource in our world, and it reminds us, I think, that what really matters is not whether you pull the lever for a fellow with an R or a D after his name every other November, but the broader context in which those choices are made. And those choices are influenced by art and media and the academy and your kids' grade school. And I think this book is a marvelous way of girding yourself for those ongoing battles, which are really the critical ones. And I would especially commend Roger for his excellent opening essay on the fortunes of permanence. We were all asked to say a couple of words about our contributions to the book, which is easier said than done in my case. I've got a couple of essays in here. One is an affectionate obituary of George Abbott, the long-lived Broadway showman who wrote and directed Pal Joey and On the Town and The Pajama Game. And the other is a piece on the fall of Western civilization and the end of the world. And there doesn't seem any obvious way to connect them. I was in Australia a few months ago, and I went into a radio studio for an interview, and I was thinking it was all going to be on the end of the world. And the producer said to me, "Well, for the first half hour, we'd like you to pick out some of your favourite songs, and then in the second half hour, we'll switch to Jihad and the end of the world." And I said, "Oh, sure, gotcha, right. We'll well-loved show tunes, and then Jihad and the Apocalypse." You know, it's an unusual programming format, but if that's what the focus groups have come up with, far be it for me to argue. But as it happens, there is a kind of connection. Now, Mr. Abbott lived to the age of 107, which means that even when he was younger, he was older than most of the folks he worked with. He gave an important helping hand to a lot of younger talent, to Rodgers and Hart, Leonard Bernstein, Comden and Green, Jerome Robbins, Frank Lesser, Bob Fosse, Kandron Ebb, a very long list. And he stayed active right to the end. He died in the middle of doing script rewrites on The Pajama Game that's currently on Broadway. He was a handsome and vigorous man right to the end, too. He directed a play with Maureen Stapleton, and he embarked on an affair with her. He was in his late 80s at the time, and Miss Stapleton started telling her girlfriends about what an amazing man he was in every respect, if you know what she means. They got a little sick of hearing about this, and eventually one of them asked, "Has he got an older brother?" which brings me to the end of the world. And that's a far smoother transition than we managed on that ABC radio show. Yeah, when he was in his late 90s, Mr. Abbott gave up playing tennis because all his partners had died. That's the situation I talk about in the second essay in the book, the one called It's the Demography, Stupid. Mr. Abbott's lack of tennis partners is exactly the same situation America's facing in respect of its transnational social life. It'll be turning up to the G8, NATO, and the EU-US summit, only to find that all its partners have died. The single most important fact about the early 21st century is the rapid aging of almost every other developed nation apart from the United States. Canada and Europe and Japan are getting old fast, older than any functioning society has ever been, and faster than any has ever aged. A society ages when its birth rate falls and it finds itself with fewer children and more grandparents, an inverted family tree, which is what things are looking like in Spain and Germany. For a stable population, which means no growth, no decline, but just 1 million people in 1950 and 1 million in 1980 and 1 million in 2010, you need a fertility rate of 2.1 births per woman, which is what America has more or less. Canada is 1.48, an all-time low, and Europe as a whole has 1.38, and Japan 1.3, and Russia 1.1, and these are rates of demographic decline from which no society has ever recovered. These countries are basically going out of business. And there's nothing wrong with old folks. I always love when Roger veers off into pop culture criticism. He gave a marvelous interview to the National Post up in Canada a few years ago, where instead of just bemoaning gangster rap and all the rest of it, as most cultural critics do, he deplored Elvis, even when Elvis was singing ballads. You know, in other words, no hip swiveling. And I think a lot of us feel like that at the new Criterion. You know, if I'm at some soiree, I'd much rather Doris Day provided the evening's musical entertainment than some ghastly hip hop guy. But even to put it like that is to become aware of how our assumptions about a society's health and about its energy are based on its youthfulness. Mr. Abbott's Broadway, for example, was brimming with a kind of rowdy, jostling, youthful energy, and that's built into its myths. You know, the famous line from 42nd Street, as the director pushes the chorus girl out on stage for her big break. You're going out there a youngster, but you've got to come back a star. It's not the same if you say you're going out there a reasonably fit 58-year-old who's had some work done, but you've got to come back a star. Our view of society largely derives from the new and from the energy that comes with youth. And it will be an interesting question whether in an age of demographic decline those myths will be sustainable. There were practical difficulties too. Nations whose welfare systems were predicated on 1950s fertility rates are going to be looking like some of the decrepit mill towns in my part of New Hampshire, where people have moved south to the Sun Belt and they've got the big suburbs and they've got the job opportunities. And in the decrepit mill town, there's just a couple of old-timers sitting at the diner and nursing a cup of coffee all day. You can imagine what shape European social programs are going to be in under those birth rates, and that's before your average pimply burger flipper decides he'd rather emigrate than pay 70% tax rates just to prop up socialised health care for Grandpa and his buddies so they can play shuffleboard for another couple of decades. That is, I think, really the critical issue that we're facing. Basically, we've decided to outsource the future. Between 2001 and 2006, Canada's population increased by 1.6 million. 400,000 of that came from natural population growth, i.e. kids, and 1.2 million came from immigration. That's to say, native Canadians were already a small minority of 25% in Canada's population growth, and there'll be a small and ever smaller minority in the Canada of the future. It's like a company where you hold an ever diminishing percentage of the stock. It might still be a great company, very successful, but if it is, it won't have much, if anything, to do with you. And when 75% of your population growth comes from immigration, that means you've taken a decision to outsource the future. The Canada of tomorrow will be determined by who that 75% are. If they're Russian, Canada will be more Russian, which will be good for hockey. If they're Chinese, Canada will be more Chinese, which isn't going to be good for hockey, but might be good for other things. But in Europe, they already know the answer to that question. Europe will be more Muslim. Islam is the principal source of population growth in Stockholm, Amsterdam, Brussels, every French city, every city down the spine of England. It's nothing to do with some crazy theory I've cooked up. You can find it out from the latest UN population report, which calls the population decline in the Western world and, in a sense, the moving in of an entirely new population. It calls it this expected global upheaval is without parallel in human history. And at the end of it, much of the inheritance of the Western world will be reduced to the state of Mr. Abbott's Broadway. That's to say, something that was once real and thriving will be reduced to a surviving rump preserved as a kind of ersatz theme park of the way things were. What Tony called the fragility of civilization. That fragility will be tested very much in the next couple of decades. And I guess that's the other thing then that's happened across the 12 years I've been at the new Criterion. I was, unlike Judge Bork, I was a genuine little Mary Sunshine when I started with this publication. I was a happy, prancing show-tune ninny, but I'm now slumped in apocalyptic gloom. You know, to mortify 42nd Street, when I got my break at the new Criterion, I went out there a youngster, but I came back a dystopian, pessimistic fusion of Anthony Daniels and Judge Bork. Let that be a lesson to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. We have some time for questions or comments if any of you would like to make them. And please go to the microphone, and you might want to specify to whom you're addressing the question.
Yes, I would like to ask Dr. Daniels, as a psychiatrist, if he thinks that these new these brain scans that are being used in court by litigants and defendants to determine emotional content and structural defect can be helpful to determine those things.
In a word, no. I think there's a great, there's a great mistake in thinking that much of the variation of human behavior is caused in a very simple physiological way. But I don't believe that, and therefore I don't really think that scans are going to help very much.
This is for Roger Kimball. You had mentioned about how the universities have become essentially bastions of left-wing politics. I'm wondering what are the reasons you think that has become like that? I mean, the students coming into the universities tend to be pretty normal. The parents paying the tuition tend to be pretty normal. The alumni sending in the contributions tend to be pretty normal. How is it that they've become sort of bastions of Stalinism?
Well, I'm not sure I would describe them as bastions of Stalinism exactly, although I would say that those bastions of Stalinism that are left in this country are primarily represented by the universities. But I think the quick answer is the 1960s. But a longer answer would involve the institutionalization of some of those ideas that that moved from the fringe to the mainstream in the late 1960s and the 1970s, and also the way in which those ideas really became identified with the elite, those people who had hitherto been entrusted with preserving and transmitting culture, not only in the universities, but also in most of our elite institutions, museums, the art world, even the world of music, the world of journalism. These people became more and more defined by the emancipationist, culturally relativist, anti-American, left-wing ideology that became so popular in the 1960s. The university is an unusual institution as well because it has perfected a means of self-replication that is not available to many other institutions, namely the institution of tenure. So it's like you have a mechanism in place that is essentially replicates the virus. These people, one group of tenured professors appoints their successors, who appoint their successors, who appoint their successors ad infinitum. And it's a curious irony that tenure, which was an institution designed to promote and protect academic freedom, has now become more or less the opposite. It is an instrument all but assuring intellectual conformity on any contentious issue. So it's a curious thing. When I published my book Tenured Radicals, which is about this subject, in 1991, I think it was, I went around to a lot of colleges and to talk about it. And at that time, the students were quite different from the students today. In many cases, they shared the left-wing program of their professors. Today, it's quite different. The students seem to be disabused, at least cynical, perhaps, but by and large, with some exceptions, mostly in graduate schools, but on the undergraduate level, the students seem to be, as you say, quite normal. Not so the faculty. They have not budged an inch, by and large. So that I have a friend who teaches at Williams who is, I believe, the one Republican on the faculty of 200. You say to Harvard, well, you don't have any, your faculty is not very diverse. And they say, oh, well, we have Harvey Mansfield. Yale has Donald Kagan, and every institution has one sort of token. Well, they don't all have one, but many of them have at least one token conservative. But unfortunately, the universities have, as I say, have perfected this way of replicating this left-wing ideology, and it's called tenure, and probably, in my opinion, should probably be rethought.
This question is for Mark Steyn. The question pertains to the comment you made with regard to the growing Arab/Muslim immigration to Great Britain. In a recent Washington Times column that you wrote, you had criticized Great Britain's weak response to the recent hostage crisis, and I wanted to know if you thought that the large Muslim Arab population in Great Britain had something to do with that, if it had something to do with the populace, the vote sway, another reason, or and/or what response do you think Great Britain ought to have done?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that the presence of significant Muslim populations in Britain and Europe is a factor in those countries' foreign policies. I think that's undeniable. People seem to think that the reason Jacques Chirac had his differences on Iraq with President Bush was because President Bush didn't speak as fluent grade school French as John Kerry does, so that he was unable to schmooze him charmingly enough at presidential banquets. It's nothing to do with that. If you had these banlieues, as they call them, where these awful alienating environments where these vast Muslim populations are housed with 50% unemployment rate, you wouldn't be eager to send your troops marching into battle in Mesopotamia alongside the great Satan. I mean, it's simply not. Jacques Chirac wouldn't like the ghastly American vernacular, but as they say here, I don't need this in my life right now, and that is the way Jacques Chirac would feel about that. and that is going to become more and more of a factor in transatlantic relations as time goes on. Now, Britain, in a way, in a strange way, is even worse, because there's no doubt that Britain, the sort of flight routes between Heathrow and Birmingham and Manchester and Pakistan are one of the sort of chief conduits for Islamists in the political sense rather than the scholarly sense of Professor Ormsby. Those flight routes. Those flight routes are one of the chief conduits by which the jihad advances from its redoubts in the Pakistani tribal lands to the wider world. If you look at the practice, for example, among those Pakistani communities in northern England of sending back for brides from the villages back home, they remain very closed communities. At the same time, I think the main reason that there's been a failure is because of the host community. They're not asked to assimilate with anything. To assimilate, an immigrant has to have something to assimilate with. You look at these fellows who blew up the London Tube. They're British subjects, born and bred. They liked cricket. They liked fish and chips. They had all the outward signs. As Tony writes very colourfully about how they have all the worst aspects of modern English youth. You can see in certain English towns like Oldham, gangs of tattooed Muslim skinheads staggering down the street on a Saturday night. There is nothing in the Quran about that. So in other words, they've absorbed, if you like, they've taken the kind of worst aspects of both cultures, which is often what multiculturalism boils down to. And I think that is a critical aspect of the problem in the United Kingdom. You know, MI5 are one of the great, they could teach the fellas running security and surveillance in the United States a lot. They did a marvellous job in Northern Ireland for decades. And they held that thing in check. But they're wrong about this, because they think, MI5 and Scotland Yard think this is like the IRA, that every couple of years they'll get lucky and they'll blow up some people in a shopping centre or a bus station or whatever. It's not. It's something far bigger. And the fact that they don't understand that is very worrying for the future of the United Kingdom.
So Mark, could I sort of follow up on that question? I was wondering, I think the questioner also asked about the British naval hostage issue and what Britain might have done. I mean, was there anything that the British Royal Navy could have done that they didn't do?
Well, I think, if you have, I think to have credibility, you've got to be prepared to be the one to raise the stakes. Often, one of the problems here is that you can successfully adopt insanity as a strategy, and that is a lot of the times what Iran and people do. In other words, they know that when they kidnap some Americans or Britons or whatever, that the rest of the world thinks they're nuts. And if you're in a room with a nut, the one thing you want to do is kind of back out the room carefully before he escalates. Again, this is something that Tony knows from his time as a prison doctor. And you're often in the same situation when you're dealing with these things. So the obligation then is always on the relatively civilized party to the dispute to lower the tension, And that gives a great advantage to Iran in these things, because the United Nations and the EU and all the transnational talking shops are saying, well, we know this guy's nuts, or he wouldn't have kidnapped your guys in the first place, so it's up to you to defuse the situation. And I'm kind of an old-fashioned imperialist in that respect. I think the sane guy should have the right to go nuts once in a while. I always like the Don Pacifico incident, which took place 150 years ago. This fellow was basically a Portuguese Jewish moneylender who happened to be living in Athens, and a mob connected to the Greek government torched his house, and he sought redress from the Greek government, and they said, get lost, you're a Portuguese Jew moneylender, we're not giving you anything. So he eventually realized that as he happened to have been born in Gibraltar, he was technically a British subject. So instead of wasting his time writing to the Greek government, he wrote to the British government. And Lord Palmerston said, well, you know, this greasy Dago Jew isn't anybody's idea of an Englishman, but the fact is a British subject is a British subject. And Palmerston organized a naval blockade of Athens, and after a couple of months, the Greeks were only too glad to settle with Don Pacifico. and the point there is, you know, civis Britannicus sum. That as Palmerston said in his speech in the House of Lords, that as the Romans said, if you held citizenship in the Roman Empire, you knew that they would protect you wherever you stood. So, if you were a British subject, you would know that the strong arm of England would protect you wherever you were on the face of the planet. And it's astonishing that, you know, I wouldn't, if you were Don Pacifico now, you wouldn't want to try seeking redress from the British government, because even the Royal Navy can't get any appropriate response from the British government. I think that speaks very poorly for the state of the world today.
If I might just come back to the problem of the Muslims in England and also in France, actually, because I think the problems are quite similar. I think the main interest that young Muslims in Britain and France have is in the oppression or suppression, domination of women, and that is the sole interest in the religion. And I've got sort of three lines of evidence, really. The first is that a huge number of Muslims are now coming into British prisons. They're overtaking all other groups. And in France, of course, it's about 60% of prisoners are Muslim. But the interesting thing is that they're not interested in the religion at all. They don't pray, they don't demand halal meat, they don't talk to the imam, and the only reason they keep Ramadan is to avoid court appearances. So they have no interest in the religion, but just let their sister go out with somebody, and they would be out there defending the honor of their sister with machetes and so on, and even guns. And then if you go into the centre of any British town on a Friday or Saturday night, which is something I wouldn't advise you to do, however, what you see is scenes of a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you'll see large numbers of young Muslim men participating enthusiastically in these scenes. But you won't see any Muslim women. And not only do you see this in England, you actually see it I've just come from Brussels, you see exactly the same thing in Brussels. And finally, I used to see a lot of women who used to try to kill themselves, or at least take overdoses, in an attempt to avoid forced marriages. They used to be taken back to Pakistan at the age of 15 or something like that. They would be told they were going on holiday, and then when they got there, they would be told they're marrying their first cousin, who's back in their village. And if they refused, they all knew actually what their fate might be. All of them knew of girls who'd been killed, hanged, or thrown off roofs or something like that. But I never saw any men who objected to this system, because of course it was very convenient for them. They got their domestic slave and sexual slave, and they were able to lead an entirely westernized life. So if you put all those three things together, I think the only hypothesis is that what really interests young Muslims in Islam is actually it gives some kind of sanction to the domination of women. And going over to France, it's very interesting that during all those riots, which I'm glad to say I predicted, nobody asked the women what they thought. And there was a good reason, of course, they couldn't find any women, but nobody even thought of that. And it's quite interesting that in the recent election, even in the most Muslim areas, Sarkozy was not wiped out. He received between 35 and 40% of the vote. Now, I don't know this, but I suspect that a very high percentage of that 38 or 40% was women. And they would have been voting for him and not Ségolène, who wants to continue the dependency culture. I think Sarkozy probably will as well, but at least he's making noises against it. And therefore he represented the only hope for women, Islamic women in France.
If, as you say, the interest these young men have is in dominating women rather than religion, how does that explain people blowing themselves up on buses?
Well, I'm talking about it as a mass phenomenon. Unfortunately, amongst the Muslims, it is actually, I think, perhaps some of the more intelligent and reflective ones who actually find an interest in Islamism as such. So there's a relatively small number who are really interested in it to that extent. And of course, one of the things, as Mark was actually alluding to, is that they have no idea about Western culture because they're not taught anything about Western culture in the schools, and they're specifically told that Western history is nothing but a story of despoliation and tyranny over others and so on and so forth. There's no such thing as achievement. And actually, looking round them, they're in areas of cities where actually our civilization doesn't look very attractive, to be perfectly honest. I mean, all the white girls are sluts and so on and so forth. So it's they don't have a very good picture of our society. They don't get it in theory and they don't see it in practice. And they're looking, like many young people, for a complete answer. And of course, Islamism is that complete answer ready to hand. So I think they are a small number, but overall the main interest in Islam, insofar as there is any interest in it, and they're not very interested, and incidentally this has been borne out also by research in French prisons, is the oppression of women. So I think it's actually the more alert and more intelligent and more thoughtful people who are becoming Islamists.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. I direct this to Roger Kimball, but if any other of the members of the panel want to chime in, I'd be happy. I was wondering to what degree you believe the postmodern rejection of the foundations of reason underwrites many of the trends that the new Criterion argues against. And as a rhetorical strategy, how do you counter a position which sees Aristotelian logic as a tool of Eurocentric oppression?
Well, I've always been a great fan of Samuel Butler's refutation of the philosophy of Bishop Berkeley, which you may recall. He was Boswell asked him what he thought of it, and he says, "You know, it's unrefutable, isn't it?" And Dr. Johnson said, "I refute it thus: kicking a rock." And that's not very satisfying intellectually, perhaps, but he was right. I mean, you know, the Berkeleyan philosophy is kind of depends upon accepting the sort of theory of universal hallucination. You know, that the material world does not exist. And I think that something similar can be said about the philosophies of what you call postmodernism. I mean, all the you know, cultural relativism, deconstruction, and that whole kind of salad of you know, philosophies that deny truth. They're all based on a very obvious self-contradiction. They, you know, and it seems to me that one of the most effective ways to argue against it is not so much to argue, but to employ the Johnson strategy, that is to say, if not exactly kicking a rock, but to use the tools, the rhetorical tools of ridicule, of polemic, Nietzsche once said that you don't refute a disease. And that's really essentially, what we're dealing with is a kind of intellectual disease. And you have to know when it's profitable to argue and when it's not. David Hume once said that there's no point in arguing with someone who's not a candid reasoner, not an open-minded reasoner. I think he was quite right about that. If someone is serious, then you take them seriously. The fundamental premise of all these postmodern philosophies is that that we should not take them seriously, that there is no such thing as truth, that there's no reason to take anything seriously. I think we should take them at their word and just make fun of them.
I think my question is for anyone who's interested in it. And everyone's sort of been saying that we're sliding towards this abyss rather rapidly. And I'm wondering if there are any concrete ideas, tangible, that we could use to sort of, form a tourniquet before we've reached that point.
Well, it has occurred to me whether, to go back to the first question, whether brain scans could help us, because I suspect there's a certain age at which one begins to believe the abyss is opening up before one. But one thing I think could be done, actually, is a more robust defense of our own civilization. And there was a lamentable episode with the Danish cartoons where we didn't support the Danes. And in this instance, actually, the French were much better. I don't know whether you know this, but there were some really very strong lampoons of the Islamists in French satirical papers. And there was only a very feeble attempt to get them banned in the French courts, which didn't work. And the reason that the papers were not attacked is that they made it perfectly clear that they would not be intimidated by these people and that they would just go on mocking them if they made any attempts to harm them. So I think really what we have to fear is fear itself.
Familiar phrase?
Perhaps I might comment. I've lived in London now for the past 2 years, and of course one of the attractions of going to England was to see all the sites of British tradition and heritage and so forth. Well, of course, it didn't turn out that way because most English I meet are quite ashamed of these things. I accept the present company here. We were invited to a Trafalgar Day celebration at which there were 6 people, and I said, I assume this is happening all over London, and they said, no, of course, this is the only one. And on the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, they reenacted the battle, and out of some kind of excessive sense of tact, refused to name the French or the Spanish who were defeated, calling them the Reds and the Blues, which sort of made mock of the whole enterprise. I would agree with both Mark and Tony that I think a vigorous defense of our own cultures and traditions is the key to it. I would have a lot more to say about the whole Islamic side of it, but I think that would be the key for me. And of course, this is one reason why I admire the new Criterion and write for it.
I think just a word on that, Roger. I think one of the problems is when you talk about new ideas, is that, in a sense, multiculturalism is a way to avoid having to have ideas, because it's a way to avoid having any discussion. It's a way to avoid having any argument, because if we live in a world of total cultural relativism, where everything is equally valid, then what's the point of discussing it? To want to discuss it or to want to argue it is antithetical to the spirit of multiculturalism. I mean, I'm always astonished at how it starts really in kindergarten. It's amazing I don't know, I probably shouldn't say this on C-SPAN as I have my children in a New Hampshire grade school, but I'm astonished at the way, compared to, I was raised by, conventionally uniculturalist teachers in the sense that they believed their own culture was the best and had made the greatest contribution to the world. But I had one teacher who spoke all kinds of obscure Asian and African languages, was fascinated by other cultures, knew tons of stuff about other cultures, but happened to think his was best. And now, the great thing about multiculturalism is you don't need to know anything about these other cultures. You just need to sort of feel warm and fluffy towards them. And it's a cult of ignorance. I find, Roger probably has this experience, you sometimes will make an assertion in a speech at some college campus or on an NPR radio show. And you'll say something about how a particular tradition has delivered longer life, better standards of living, greater prosperity, greater freedom to more parts of the world than certain other cultures. And then somebody will call up and say, well, you're being very hierarchical about all this. And you say, no, well, this is just observable fact. And you state some statistics showing about which countries have the highest GDP and which countries have the longest life expectancy and highest literacy and so forth. And then the person will respond, well, that's just your opinion. And you were... Robert Frost had a great line on. He said, "Free verse is like playing tennis with the net down." It's very hard to have a discussion when it would be impossible to play tennis against someone who thinks your ace is a social construct. And that's basically the situation that you're in when you try and debate these things on NPR or at some college. It's moved beyond. It's a world without isms. Multiculturalism is the uniculturalism, the universalism.
Two more questions, Donald.
Oh, yeah. Andrew Roberts, in his book on English-speaking people since 1900, gives a few pages on the Amritsar affair, in which the general in charge killed 100 or so people, thereby saving the lives of perhaps hundreds of thousands. Now, taking a very long view, say from 2200, it's not quite subspecie aeternitis, but it's long enough, we could well inquire whether it won't be written or theorized that a society which absolutely forgoes the use of force against violence in the streets, who permits its cities to be burned down without recourse, who will not administer the proverbial whiff of grape shot to control the crowds, whether such a society has got long survival value.
No. It seems to me that one of the curious features of our society today is that we seem to have bred out of ourselves the instinct for self-preservation. And, Sam Littman, the founding publisher of the New Criterion, used to talk about this strange animal that, when attacked, would fight back. It seems to me that Western civilization is being besieged by the most virulent challenge to its survival since the Battle of Lepanto. At least with communism, you could count on those guys having some rudimentary allegiance to the principle of self-preservation themselves. I'm not sure that you can count on that with our friend Mr. Ahmadinejad. I mean, just to take as one concrete, if Iran got nuclear weapons, do we believe that he would scruple about using them? I don't. But anyone else want to?
Well, I don't know whether you were talking about France at all when you were talking about burning cities and the lack of response. However, I must say that I'm slightly more optimistic about, well, I don't know whether it's optimistic or pessimistic about France, but one of the things you probably noticed about the riots in France was that the rioters didn't go into the centre of any French city, and I actually had the rather odd experience of sitting in a quite fancy restaurant in one city and listening to people talking about their psychotherapy and so on. And a few hundred yards up the road, people were burning cars. And the main reason for this was that the population, I think the main reason they felt very secure was that that the head of the CRS, the French riot police, had made a statement which everyone in France understood the meaning of. He said, the worse things are, the more serene we are. And everyone who knows the CRS knows what that means. But at some time, if the, how can I say, the balance of forces changes and the people in the banlieue think that they could possibly overcome the CRS, or it could be very serious in France, and there would be serious violence. But I wouldn't underestimate France's instincts of self-preservation. Unfortunately, they are likely to be murderous, and I think there's even the possibility in some parts of Europe of a final solution returning. That's what is really terrible.
No, wait a minute. Which are you talking about Jews, or are you talking about Muslims?
Muslims. I mean, I think that there's a serious threat of civil war in France at some time in the not very distant future, and the French would be very ruthless, of course. Well, it's not a very pleasant prospect.
Mark, do you want to? You actually more or less addressed this question in your book, which, by the way, after you buy Counterpoints, if you haven't bought Mark's book, you should. It's called America Alone. You can see it's on the bestseller list in the New York Times Book Review, but that's the only place it's been in the New York Times Book Review.
I was strolling down 6th Avenue today, and I saw the strange sight of someone reading my book while slumped in the doorway of the Duane Reade Pharmacy on the corner of 44th Street. I don't know whether just the compulsion to read my book was a terrible side effect of whatever medication they just bought. So I don't know whether that was good publicity or bad publicity, but it was a striking sight. I agree with Tony. I think one of the odd things about the Continentals is that the fragility of civilization, as he puts it, is actually very thin in their case. You're talking about countries that in many cases were dictatorships and totalitarian societies only a generation or two ago. I mean, we're not even going back to the Second World War. If you think most of the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Greece, Portugal, these countries were dictatorships as recently as the 1970s. So I think the idea of sustained, peaceful constitutional evolution, such as America, Canada, Britain, Australia have known, is actually very foreign to the continent's traditions. And the idea that some of these people, as they see various parts of their great cities being annexed by people that they regard as hostile invaders, the idea that they won't seek the old sort of strong man on a horse approach is to credit them with greater sophistication than they have. The reality is that they'll be winding up with kind of dime store Mussolinis because this is where the demography kicks in. Simply put, it is not going to be possible to accomplish. I don't think it will be possible in any meaningful way to accomplish a final solution, simply because I think some of these societies are so demographically weakened, but that doesn't mean they won't try it. And one of the reasons why I think Britain is actually in a worse state than France in some respects is because the British are more, they are more genially tolerant of some of these provocations than the French are. As you say, when the CRS decide to go in somewhere, they'll go in hard. Britain is a bizarre, if Osama bin Laden, I wouldn't be surprised, they say Osama bin Laden is holed up in a cave in Pakistan. It would not surprise surprise me if you bought Rupert Murdoch's son tomorrow morning and it turned out he'd been living on welfare in a council flat in Manchester for 4 years while his appeal against deportation was being heard. They are an almost boundlessly tolerant nation, and that gives them that puts them at a disadvantage compared to some of their continental neighbours.
Well, France is almost an apartheid state, in effect. If you go to the banlieue, what it reminded me of most was South Africa, and one of the reasons the riots were allowed to continue was, well, it's the old what the Afrikaners used to say: they're fouling their own nest, and that was their attitude. And that was why they didn't go into the centre of the town, because if they knew they went into the centre of the town, things would be very different. Whether that's better or worse than Britain, I don't know.
Yes, sir.
This question is for anyone on the panel who wishes to answer. What, if anything, can be done to allow and persuade conservative students to enter academia and to pursue careers as judges and in constitutional law?
As what?
Or as to be a judge or a professor.
Well, how do you encourage them? You don't have to encourage them. They all want to be judges. The problem is getting the right ones on the bench. You know, they're being educated in the law schools to the idea that the Constitution is a launching pad for good social projects. And I remember when I was first named a judge, some of the clerks who were just recent law graduates had me to lunch, and they asked me why I wanted to be a judge. They asked me about being a judge. And I described the idea of faithfulness to the original understanding of the Constitution and so forth. And they looked at me somewhat aghast and said, then why do you want to be a judge? Because they see it as a power position in which you impose your superior values upon really a backward population. You can see, you know, they were clearly headed for the normalization of homosexuality, including same-sex marriage as a constitutional right, until recently, until Massachusetts did it, and the outburst, I think, daunted the federal judges. But it's not a question of encouraging them to be judges, it's a question of educating them correctly so that you can pick out some that will perform the judicial function properly instead of regarding themselves as legislators.
This will be the last question, I think.
Sure. All the speakers tonight are gentlemen of a certain age, as I am, and so I'm not being particularly critical of them, but through the ages, old men have sat around the village square and chatted to each other and said things aren't what they used to be. And when I look at the world now, comparing it with 1982, which is when I think the magazine started, in some ways things are immeasurably better. People are richer, there's more water in the world, less people are starving. We have the brilliance of the internet. I look at my 3 kids and think we have a excess of 2.2 in our family, and things seem absolutely fantastic. Do you never just sit down and worry that we're not just all crotchety old men worrying about the wrong things, and things are actually going pretty well?
Gosh, maybe we should leave it at that. I don't know. I think we won't quite leave it at that. I think we you know, in one respect, you're right. I mean, it was the best of times, it's the worst of times situation. The world has never been as rich as it is now. You know, thanks largely to the much decried Western civilization and its primary engine, capitalism, which are, you know, but that is not to say that all the pathologies we've been talking about this evening are not also with us. And indeed, you know, it's a very curious world we live in now, where yes, you know, we are immensely rich. Our military is, I mean, you know, just stronger than, you know, the next 20 countries put together, and so on. And yet, you go, I mean, and our universities in many ways are the best in the world. We have people coming here, at least in the sciences and so on. And yet, all you need to do is turn on the television or take a walk down to your local museum or go to your local university or look at the recent decisions of the Supreme Court or see what's happening demographically in Europe. It's there's a kind of stereo effect here. And, I think it would be naive to mistake this, material plenitude with cultural health, or spiritual health. They're different things. But I'd be curious to know what some of my fellow panelists think about that.
Well, generally, I believe in keeping a sunny disposition, and I take your point. The thing is, historically, great civilizations often they burn at their brightest until just before they go out. If you've been the Roman legionnaires looking across the river in Germany at the savages that you were facing, you represented the absolute pinnacle of civilization. You were richer than anyone had ever been. You were the best equipped and most technologically advanced army the world had ever seen. You had better health care than anyone up to that time had had. And you lived in better homes. You had a more developed art and culture and all the rest of it. And these guys standing across the river from you wearing animal skins, what did they have? They were a joke. How could you possibly lose to them? Well, they lost. And I think that's the. That is the point, that sometimes incredibly advanced societies can somehow lose those primal impulses that ensure their survival. You said you've got small children. I've got small children. I don't think it's very. You say we're crotchety old men. I feel myself in vigorous health. I don't particularly feel the ruddy glow of late middle age has yet faded from my cheeks. But I think when my little girl is my age, visiting Paris or Brussels is going to be a difficult and unpleasant experience for a Western woman at that time. So I'd like my kids to grow up and have the good times that I've enjoyed, but I think that depends on a kind of societal, the eternal vigilance, which is what liberty requires. So I certainly believe we should be optimistic about it. I would be happy for Judge Bork's next Jeremiah to be ghosted by Little Mary Sunshine, or perhaps she could just provide a kind of buoyant gloss on it for the introduction. I think it's important to be optimistic, but we shouldn't disguise ourselves, shouldn't delude ourselves about the very serious threats we face.
Well, I'd like to thank the Center for the Humanities again, and thank all of you for coming. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks very much.